Many argue the conflict isn't over.
Well, then why was there a banner that said mission accomplished on the aircraft carrier?
How are things going in Afghanistan now?
I think we're doing fine. I think we'll do fine. The second phase, if I could just make it very quickly, the second phase is Iraq. There is some indication, and I don't have the conclusions, but some of this anthrax may, and I emphasize may have come from Iraq.
Oh, is that right?
Senator John McCain was an early, vocal, and enthusiastic proponent of invading Iraq in 2003, saying we would be, quote, welcomed as liberators. In November of that year, he was asked whether or not he was still concerned about Afghanistan, a war effort that had essentially been raided for troops and supplies in order to start a second simultaneous war in Iraq.
In the long term, we may muddle through in Afghanistan.
We'll muddle through Afghanistan. Senator McCain's record on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is clear, and it's something that should not be forgotten. But here in Washington, where political expediency often matters more than integrity, Senator McCain is now a leading proponent of dramatically increasing our troop numbers in a conflict he once said we could muddle through. And there's no acknowledgement and no apology that the war in Iraq contributed to the mess in Afghanistan. Instead, there is only the here and now.
Do you think the United States can win in Afghanistan with fewer than 40,000 more troops?
I do not, and I think the great danger now is not an American pullout.
Senator McCain is now being joined in the Afghanistan drone beating by conservative Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein, head of the Intelligence Committee, who, like McCain, voted in 2003 for war against Iraq. As recently as 2 weeks ago, Senator Feinstein said the president should take his time to make the right decision on Afghanistan.
I think the president is correct to take his time to really examine what the alternatives are at this time.
But now Feinstein is joining Republicans like John McCain in saying Mr. Obama needs to hurry up and send more troops.
I think the decision has to be made sooner rather than later.
Feinstein and McCain and the other conservatives arguing for more troops right now for Afghanistan say that the president must follow that course because a troop increase has been recommended by the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan. Of course, in America, the commander-in-chief doesn't take orders from the military. He gives orders. But hawks know they're on firmer political ground if they look like they're just pushing respect for the generals rather than making recommendations based on their own troubling records. Here now, Gordon Goldstein, a former international security advisor to the United Nations and author of the book Lessons in Disaster, McGeorge Bundy and the Path to War in Vietnam. Mr. Goldstein, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
What's your reaction to Senators Feinstein and McCain arguing for more troops in Afghanistan on the basis that the president must follow the strategy recommended by the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan?
Well, fortunately, Senator McCain and Senator Feinstein represent exactly 2% of the Senate, and they're entitled to voice their opinion, but it should not be used to try to accelerate an extremely critical decision that the president has to make on his own timeline. This is a decision that the president must focus on in a methodical fashion, a dispassionate fashion. It has to be based on a clear strategic review of our success thus far and our failure, and that's what he's precisely trying to do.
What are your thoughts on General McChrystal's call for 40,000 more troops? I mean, if President Obama does not agree with McChrystal's plan, will the president be forced to look for another general who's more in line with his overall strategy?
You know, it's very interesting. There's a parallel here to what President Kennedy encountered in 1961. In that year, another young, untested president was presented with a half a dozen different proposals to send in the first ground combat forces to South Vietnam. He was essentially encircled by his senior advisors who in November of that year told him the odds were strongly against prevailing there if he didn't send in a commitment of troops that would be the down payment on a total force of 200,000 men. Kennedy was not intimidated. Kennedy was not pressured. Kennedy stood his ground. And what we're seeing here is another instance where a young president is being pressured by those who have a very strong view about the necessary increase of troop numbers. But this president has to determine whether he believes this is in fact the necessary mission for the United States, population protection, General McChrystal's stated mission, and whether in fact that mission is viable. And I believe that there are serious questions about both of these propositions.
A new PBS documentary on the war in Afghanistan is called Obama's War. Is that fair? I mean, Mr. Obama's been in office less than 10 months. Is this really his war?
Well, he inherited it. and he inherited a terrible mess. Deteriorating security situation, a corrupt and ineffectual government, and declining public opinion for support of the war. But one of the facts that is missed in all the noise around this debate is that the president also inherited what was a fairly successful policy with respect to counterterrorism. And he has appropriated the Bush administration policy of targeting the al-Qaeda infrastructure, and he's in fact expanded it. There were 36 drone and predator attacks in 2008. By some measures, we've hit 15 in the top 20 al-Qaeda leadership. And this strategy has proven somewhat successful, although that fact is not featured in the current debate, in which we appear that, according to those urging the president to make this commitment, Afghanistan stands on the precipice of collapse. I'm not sure that's true.
You talk about the issue of success, for example, with the Predator drones. Overall, regardless of whether the Afghan war is Obama's war or not, ultimately, will the outcome essentially be put and be decided, I mean, depending on how this war goes, is that the ultimate arbiter in terms of whether or not this is Obama's war and whether this is on his shoulders? Well, you know, one of the lessons that President Kennedy learned, again in 1961, is that you can receive all of the advice from the best minds around you, but at the end, counselors advise, but presidents decide. Kennedy learned that lesson the hard way at the Bay of Pigs when he authorized a disastrous invasion of that island. And after that, he was determined to evaluate every military proposal that came to him with a strict, cool realism, with a dispassionate rigor, because he understood that he owned that strategy. He owned military success, and he owned military failure. And yes, this president is going to be learning that same lesson. He's going to own the outcome in Afghanistan. That's why I believe he is so determined to pause the clock, to not be rushed, to not be crowded, to arrive at his own conclusions through what he does best, thinking methodically, thinking deliberately, thinking strategically. Gordon Goldstein, former International Security Advisor to the United Nations and author of the book, Lessons in Disaster, McGeorge Bundy and the Path to War in Vietnam. Thanks so much for your time today.
Pleasure to be with you.